The history of the Bahamas begins with the earliest arrival of humans in the islands in the first millennium AD. The first inhabitants of the islands now known as the Bahamas were the Lucayans, an Arawakan-speaking Taino people, who arrived between about 500 and 800 from the islands of the Caribbean. Their ancestors came from mainland South America, where Arawakan language peoples were present in most territories, and especially along the northeastern coast. Recorded history began on 12 October 1492, when Christopher Columbus landed on the island of Guanahani, which he renamed San Salvador Island on his first voyage to the New World. The earliest permanent European settlement occurred in 1648 on Eleuthera. During the 18th century slave trade, many Africans were brought to the Bahamas as laborers. Their descendants constitute 85% of the Bahamian population. The Bahamas gained independence from the United Kingdom on July 10, 1973. Prehistory. Sometime between 500 to 800 Tainos began crossing in dugout canoes from Hispaniola or Cuba to the Bahamas. Suggested routes for the earliest migrations have been from Hispaniola to the Caicos Islands, from Hispaniola or eastern Cuba to Great Anagua Island, and from central Cuba to Long Island. William Keegan argues that the most likely route was from Hispaniola or Cuba to Great Anagua. Granberry and Vesalius argue for two migrations, from Hispaniola to the Turks and Caicos Islands, and from Cuba to Great Anagua. From the initial colonization, the Lucayan expanded throughout the Bahamas in some 800 years, growing to a population of about 40,000. Population density at the time of first European contact was highest in the south-central area of the Bahamas, declining towards the north, reflecting the migration pattern and progressively shorter time of occupation of the northern islands. Known Lucayan settlement sites are confined to the 19 largest islands in the archipelago, or to smaller cays located less than 1 km from those islands. Population density in the southernmost Bahamas remained lower, probably due to the drier climate there. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed from Spain on his first voyage with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the flagship, Santa Maria, seeking a direct route to Asia. On 12 October 1492, Columbus reached an island in the Bahamas and claimed it for Spain, an event long regarded by Europeans as the discovery of America. The island was called Guanahani by the Lucayan, and San Salvador by the Spanish. The identity of the first American landfall by Columbus remains controversial, but many authors accept Samuel E. Morrison's identification of Columbus's San Salvador as what was later called Watling Island. Its name has been officially changed to San Salvador. Columbus visited several other islands in the Bahamas before sailing to present-day Cuba and afterwards to Hispaniola. The Bahamas held little interest to the Spanish except as a source of slave labor. Nearly the entire population of Lucayan were transported to other islands as laborers over the next 30 years. When the Spanish decided to remove the remaining Lucayans to Hispaniola in 1520, they could find only 11. The islands remained abandoned and depopulated for 130 years afterwards. With no gold to be found, and the population removed, the Spanish effectively abandoned the Bahamas. They retained titular claims to them until the Treaty of Paris in 1783, when they ceded them to Britain in exchange for East Florida. When Europeans first landed on the islands, they reported the Bahamas were lushly forested, cleared to develop the land for sugarcane plantations. The forests have not regrown and have not been replanted. Early English settlement. For many years, historians believed that the Bahamas was not colonized until the 17th century. However, recent studies show that there may have been attempts of colonization by groups from Spain, France, Britain and other Amerindians. The French settled in Abaco in 1565, and tried again in 1625. In 1648 a group from Bermuda called the Company of Adventurers for the Plantation of the Islands of Eleutheria, which was led by William Sale, sailed to the Bahamas to found a colony. These early settlers were Puritans and Republicans. Bermuda was becoming overcrowded, and the Bahamas offered both religious and political freedom and economic opportunity. The larger of the company's two ships, the William, wrecked on the reef at the north end of what is now called Eleuthera Island, with the loss of all provisions. Despite the arrival of additional settlers, including Europeans, slaves and former African slaves from Bermuda, and the receipt of relief supplies from Virginia and New England, the Eleuthera colony struggled for many years. It was hampered because of poor soil, fighting between settlers, and conflict with the Spanish. In the mid-1650s many of the settlers returned to Bermuda. The remaining settlers founded communities on Harbor Island and St. George's Cay at the north end of Eleuthera. In 1670 about 20 families lived in the Eleuthera communities. In 1666 other colonists from Bermuda settled on New Providence, which soon became the center of population and commerce in the Bahamas, with almost 500 people living on the island by 1670. Unlike the Eleutherians, who were primarily farmers, the first settlers on New Providence made their living from the sea, salvaging wrecks, making salt, and taking fish, turtles, conchs and ambergris. Farmers from Bermuda soon followed the seamen to New Providence, where they found good, plentiful land. Neither the Eleutherian colony nor the settlement on New Providence had any legal standing under English law. In 1670 the proprietors of Carolina were issued a patent for the Bahamas, but the governors sent by the proprietors had difficulty imposing their authority on the independent-minded residents of New Providence. The early settlers continued to live much as they had in Bermuda, fishing, hunting turtles, whales, and seals, finding ambergris, making salt on the drier islands, cutting the abundant hardwoods of the islands for lumber, dyewood and medicinal bark, and wrecking, or salvaging wrecks. The Bahamas were close to the sailing routes between Europe and the Caribbean, so shipwrecks in the islands were common, and wrecking was the most lucrative occupation available to the Bahamians, wrecking wreckers, privateers and pirates. The Bahamians soon came into conflict with the Spanish over the salvaging of wrecks. The Bahamian wreckers drove the Spanish away from their wrecked ships, and attacked Spanish salvages, seizing goods the Spanish had already recovered from the wrecks. When the Spanish raided the Bahamas, the Bahamians in turn commissioned privateers against Spain, even though England and Spain were at peace. In 1684 the Spanish burned the settlements on New Providence and Eleuthera, after which they were largely abandoned. New Providence was settled a second time in 1686 by colonists from Jamaica. In the 1690s English privateers made a base in the Bahamas. In 1696 Henry Ebrey, using the assumed name Henry Bridgman, brought his ship Fancy, loaded with pirates' loot, into Nassau Harbor. Ebrey bribed the governor, Nicholas Trott, with gold and silver, and by leaving him the Fancy, still loaded with 50 tons of elephant tusks, an average haul for a slaver, and 100 barrels of gunpowder, exceedingly rare. Following peace with France in 1697, many of the privateers became pirates. From this time the pirates increasingly made Nassau, the Bahamian capital, founded in 1694, the base. The governors appointed by the proprietors usually made a show of suppressing the pirates, but most were accused of dealing with them. By 1701 England was at war with France and Spain. In 1703 and in 1706 combined French-Spanish fleets attacked and sacked Nassau, after which some settlers left, and the proprietors gave up on trying to govern the islands. With no functioning government in the Bahamas, English privateers operated from Nassau as their base, in what has been called the Privateers' Republic, which lasted for 11 years. The raiders attacked French and Spanish ships, while French and Spanish forces burned Nassau several times. The War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1714, but some privateers were slow to get the news, or reluctant to accept it, and slipped into piracy. One estimate puts at least 1,000 pirates in the Bahamas in 1713, outnumbering the 200 families of more permanent settlers. The Privateers' Republic in Nassau became a Pirates' Republic. At least 20 pirate captains used Nassau or other places in the Bahamas as a home port during this period, including Henry Jennings, Edward Teach, Benjamin Hornigold and Stede Bonnet. Many settler families moved from New Providence to Eleuthera or Abaco to escape harassment from the pirates. On the other hand, residents of Harbor Island were happy to serve as middlemen for the pirates, as merchants from New England and Virginia came there to exchange needed supplies for pirate plunder. As mentioned above, the activities of pirates provoked frequent and brutal retaliatory attacks by the French and Spanish, reclaiming Bahamas for the crown. Starting in 1713, Wood S. Rogers had conceived the idea of leading an expedition to Madagascar to suppress the pirates there and establish it as a British colony. Rogers' friends Richard Steele and Joseph Addison eventually convinced him to tackle the pirates' nest in the Bahamas. Instead, Rogers and others formed a company to fund the venture. They persuaded the proprietors of Carolina to surrender the government of the Bahamas to the king, while retaining title to the land. In 1717, King George appointed Rogers governor of the Bahamas and issued a proclamation granting a pardon to any pirate who surrendered to a British governor within 1 year. Word of the appointment of a new governor and of the offer of pardons reached Nassau ahead of Rogers and his forces. Some of the pirates were willing to accept a pardon and retire from piracy. Henry Jennings and Christopher Winter sailed off to find British authorities to confirm their acceptance of the amnesty. Others were not ready to give up. Many of those were Jacobites, supporters of the House of Stuart, who identified as enemies of the Hanoverian King George. Still others simply identified as rebels, or thought they were better off as pirates than trying to earn an honest living. When a Royal Navy ship brought official word to Nassau of the pardon offer, many pirates planned to accept. Soon, however, the recalcitrant parties gained the upper hand, eventually forcing the Navy ship to leave. Blackbeard, Stede Bonnet, Nicholas Brown and Edmund Condent left the Bahamas for other territories. Charles Vane, with Calico Jack Rackham and Edward England in his crew, came to prominence at this time. Vane worked to organize resistance to the anticipated arrival of royal authority, even appealing to the James Francis Edward Stuart, the Stuart Pretender, for aid in holding the Bahamas and capturing Bermuda for the Stuarts. As aid from the Stuarts failed to materialize and the date for Rogers' arrival approached, Vane and his crew prepared to leave Nassau. Wood S. Rogers arrived in Nassau in late July 1718, with his own 460-ton warship, 3 ships belonging to his company, and an escort of 3 ships of the Royal Navy. Vane's ship was trapped in Nassau Harbor. His crew set that ship on fire, sending it towards Rogers' ships, and escaped in the ensuing confusion in a smaller ship they had seized from another pirate. The remaining population welcomed Rogers. They comprised about 200 settlers and 500 to 700 pirates who wanted to receive pardons, most prominently Benjamin Hornigold. After the pirates' surrender, the proprietors leased their land in the Bahamas to Rogers' company for 21 years. Rogers controlled Nassau, but Charles Vane was loose and threatening to drive the governor and his forces out. Learning that the King of Spain wanted to expel English from the islands, Rogers worked to improve the defences of Nassau. He lost nearly 100 men of the new forces due to an unidentified disease, and the Navy ships left for other assignments. Rogers sent 4 of his ships to Havana to assure the Spanish governor that he was suppressing piracy and to trade for supplies. The crews of ex-pirates and men who had come with Rogers all turned to piracy. The ex-pirate Benjamin Hornigold later caught 10 men at Green Turtle Cay as part of Rogers' suppression effort. 8 were found guilty and hanged in front of the fort. Vane attacked several small settlements in the Bahamas, but, after he refused to attack a stronger French frigate, he was deposed for cowardice and replaced as captain by Calico Jack Rackham. Vane never returned to the Bahamas. He was eventually caught, convicted and executed in Jamaica, after nearly being captured by Jamaican privateers, and hearing that the king had extended the deadline for pardons for piracy. Rackham and his crew returned to Nassau to surrender to Woodis Rogers. In Nassau, Rackham became involved with Anne Bonny. He tried to arrange an annulment of her marriage to another ex-pirate, James Bonny. Rogers blocked the annulment, and Rackham and Bonny left Nassau to be pirates again, taking a small crew and Bonny's friend Mary Read with them. Within months, Rackham, Bonny and Read were captured and taken to Jamaica. They were convicted of piracy, and Rackham was executed. Bonny and Read were sent to prison, as both were pregnant and therefore excluded from execution. Read died in prison, while Bonny's fate is unknown. When Britain and Spain went to war again in 1719, many of the ex-pirates were commissioned by the British government as privateers. A Spanish invasion fleet set out for the Bahamas, but was diverted to Pensacola, Florida when it was seized by the French. Rogers continued to improve the defenses of Nassau, spending his personal fortune and going heavily into debt to do so. A second Spanish invasion fleet in 1720 was deterred by the defenses. Rogers returned to Britain in 1722 to plead for repayment of the money he had borrowed to build up Nassau, only to find he had been replaced as governor. He was sent to debtor's prison, although his creditors later absolved his debts, gaining him release. After the publication in 1724 of A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, which praised Rogers' efforts to suppress piracy in the Bahamas, his fortunes began to improve. The king awarded him a pension, retroactive to 1721. In 1728, Rogers was appointed governor of the Bahamas for a second term. He dissolved the colony's assembly when it would not approve taxes to repair Nassau's defenses. He died in Nassau in 1732. Mid-century. In 1741, Governor John Tinker and Peter Henry Bruce constructed Fort Montague. Additionally, the governor also reported a privateering boom in the 13 colonies in North America. He also reported that over 2,300 sumptuous houses were built, and in 1768 Governor William Shirley filled in mosquito breeding swamps and extended Nassau. Loyalists, slaves and Afro-Seminoles. During the American War of Independence, the Bahamas fell to Spanish forces under General Galvez in 1782. A British-American Loyalist expedition led by Colonel Andrew Devoe recaptured the islands in 1783. After the American Revolution, the British issued land grants to American Loyalists who went into exile. The sparse population of the Bahamas tripled within a few years. The Loyalists developed cotton as a commodity crop, but it dwindled from insect damage and soil exhaustion. In addition to slaves they brought with them, the planters' descendants imported more African slaves for labor. Most of the current inhabitants in the islands are descended from the slaves brought to work on the Loyalist plantations. In addition, thousands of captive Africans, who were liberated from foreign slave ships by the British Navy after the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, were resettled as free persons in the Bahamas. In the early 1820s, hundreds of African slaves and Seminoles escaped from Florida, most settling on Andros Island in the Bahamas. 300 escaped in a mass flight in 1823. While the flow was reduced by federal construction of a lighthouse at Cape Florida in 1825, slaves continued to find freedom in the Bahamas. In August 1834, the traditional plantation life ended with the British emancipation of slaves throughout most of its colonies. Freedmen chose to work on their own small plots of land when possible. Post-emancipation. In the 1830s and 1840s, tensions rose between Britain and the United States after American merchant ships, part of the coastwise slave trade, put into Nassau or were wrecked on its reefs. These included the Hermosa and the Creole, the latter brought in after a slave revolt on board. Britain had notified nations that slaves brought into Bahama and Bermuda waters would be forfeited and freed the slaves, refusing U.S. efforts to recover them. In 1853, Britain and the U.S. signed a claims treaty and submitted to arbitration for claims dating to 1814. They paid each other in 1855. During the American Civil War, the Bahamas prospered as a base for Confederate blockade running, bringing in cotton to be shipped to the mills of England and running out arms and munitions. None of these provided any lasting prosperity to the islands, nor did attempts to grow different kinds of crops for re-export. With emancipation, Caribbean societies inherited a rigid racial stratification that was reinforced by the unequal distribution of wealth and power. The three-tier race structure, of whites, mixed race, and primarily blacks, who comprised the large majority, existed well into the 1940s and in some societies beyond. Like African Americans, many also have European and Native American ancestry. Caribbean societies continue to struggle with racial issues. Late colonial period. In 1911, there was a short-lived movement to make the Bahamas part of Canada. Although the movement enjoyed the support of many in Nassau and from the head of Sun Life, a Canadian insurance company, the movement failed. The failure of the movement was, in part, due to the British government's opposition to uniting a predominantly black colony with a predominantly white country.